friends who I've seen fairly recently, but in some cases maybe not so. And thanks for coming out on a Saturday morning to hear someone who is going to definitely be dropping science and dropping knowledge for us here in Albany. And this is not Bill's first visit to Albany either, but this is one that's special because we helped to organize it. And it's for Ukraine Solidarity Capital District. My notes are on my phone, so you're going to have to give me time to find the document. Thank you very much. But I just wanted to say something about Ukraine Solidarity Capital District, which is the organizer and sponsor of this event. And this is our very short mission statement. Through our words and actions, the members of Ukraine Solidarity Capital District stand for Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity, and its right as a sovereign and democratic state to pursue whatever national goals it thinks best. We condemn the Russian aggression, invasion, and occupation, and demand that the Russian Federation immediately stop its war on Ukraine and completely withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory. And you'll find this flyer on the literature table. So you can certainly take a copy, and if you're really interested in what we talk about today, please feel free to join us and to get involved. We meet about every 2 weeks online, so you don't have to leave your home, particularly as winter approaches. That's always a big plus to me. And what we do besides be involved in these issues in general, because we also, most of us are also at least affiliated and sometimes active in the national organization, which is Ukraine Solidarity Network. We also plan a lot of events, and I was thinking how this is our either third or fourth event since September. So we're hustling, we're doing the best that we can. These kinds of, most of our events are, well, several of our events actually have been in person when I talk about events, but they haven't necessarily been here in the community in Albany. We had a film showing in Hudson in October. We also had a speaker at the New York State Writers Institute Book Festival who is a Ukrainian historian from Ukraine who also teaches at Harvard, a distinguished professor at Harvard, and he has written books about Ukraine and runs the Ukraine Center at Harvard. So he was a part of the book festival. I don't know how many of you actually got out for that one. But anyway, we're very happy to have you here today. Sitting next to me is my friend, my longtime friend, Bill Fletcher. And we're going to have, he wanted to do like an interview format for whatever reason. I think it's a good idea. And I will be asking him questions. As you know probably from having seen the flyer, he is an author, an activist, a labor activist, and also has been involved in many issues that have been really important to our progressive and left communities and our black communities from the 20th century until now. Bill and I met in the 1990s, in the late 1990s, when we were both working on the Black Radical Congress, something that not enough people know about, but only 2,000 people came to the meeting at the University of Illinois Chicago campus in the spring, I think the spring of 1998.
Juneteenth.
Yeah, Juneteenth. Oh, right. That's still spring, theoretically.
That's right. That's right.
2 days before, or 1 day before. Anyway, we had worked on that, and then we had the wonderful opportunity to know each other, but not ever really to be involved in an organization together as we are now. So I'm going to start by asking my first question, if I can find it. I think I will be able to find it. And I do want to acknowledge another person who's here, who's visiting us, and that is Candace. Is Candace Kaysen still?
Yeah.
That's Candace, Dr. Candace Kaysen, who is Bill's partner and who is a longtime friend of mine, although we haven't been in touch except through Bill for a number of years. But we met actually in Boston in the 1970s when we were young black feminists. As my memory served me, I said, I think we worked on violence against women, and Candace confirmed that last night, that that's what we were working on when we met in Boston. So, anyway, Bill, you were a founder of the Ukraine Solidarity Network. Why did you decide to get involved in doing solidarity organizing with Ukraine?
So before I get started, I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank you thank the Ukraine Solidarity Network Capital District for inviting me. I want to say what an honor and pleasure it is to have this discussion with Barbara. I like interview formats in general, but particularly when it's someone that I think so highly of. Engaging in a discussion, it just means a lot to me. So this is just delightful. So the answer to your question is that we have been witnessing, we live in such a hypocritical world where invasions and occupations take place, they get justified, they get condemned, and then the same people that condemn them go on and carry out their own invasions and occupations. And it becomes very difficult to try to make headway. And part of my politics has always been, what's been central to it is the idea of national self-determination and national sovereignty, and also anti-authoritarianism. So part of what affected me when it came to Ukraine was the clear violation of international law by the Russians. And on top of that, the attempt by Putin to erase the Ukrainians. And I want to come back to that in a second. The other thing was just simply who Putin is and my growing fears of the Russian regime. And I've looked at Putin as the co-godfather with Donald Trump of global right-wing authoritarianism. And so virtually anything that Putin does or says, I end up on the other side. And so those things sort of collaborated to get me involved. But I think it was the threat to erase the Ukrainians that had a real impact on me. And what we see, and we've seen this for a very long time, I'm not talking about just the last few decades, we're talking about in the age of colonialism and imperialism, the attempt to erase populations. And the Ukrainians have suffered from that for a very, very long time. So that affected me, and I said, so what am I going to do?
You have some of the most extensive knowledge of international politics and history of anyone I am privileged to know. Could you give us an outline of the history that has resulted in the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022?
So I want to start by saying that there are friends that take the position that the Russians, it's what I call the devil made me do it theory. And it's that the Russians would never have invaded Ukraine had it not been for NATO expansion, etc. And that's a reasonable position if you ignore history. And so it's really important to dig into history and to at least go into the 19th century, if not early 20th century, and understand the colonial relationship that Ukraine has had with Russia. And it was when Lenin and others described Russia as a prison house of nations, one of the nations were the Ukrainians, along with others that were captured by the Russian Empire. And so the initial platform of the Bolshevik Party was of national self-determination, up to and including secession. And so So Ukraine then ends up in a struggle, including the Ukrainian leftists, about its relationship with post-revolutionary Russia and whether it would be a fully independent republic. Now, this may sound like a real tangent, so forgive me because I just love history. What you have to understand is that in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, there was this incredible debate about what should happen to the former prison house and what should happen to the different nations and developing nations in the Russian Empire. So one position was basically everybody got merged into Soviet Russia. And even though Stalin articulated something different in terms of his writings, he was basically someone that believed in that. Then you had people like Lenin and others that said that we have to build a very different kind of state, which they ultimately called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And that was supposed to be the prototype for a global reorganization. And that didn't happen because the revolutions didn't spread. But within the USSR, there was a debate among the different nations about their relationship to the USSR. And one debate took place in Ukraine, and another major debate took place in what was called at the time Turkestan. And there was an idea that these should become fully independent republics that were linked together more loosely with this thing called the USSR. And that view got defeated, ultimately. And the proponents of those views ultimately got purged and in many cases executed, like Mir Said Sultan Galiev out of Turkestan and others. So Ukraine becomes a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, but it's subordinate to a Russian-dominated USSR. When the USSR collapses, one of the things that's important is that the Ukrainians as a people vote for independence, and this independence is recognized by the Russian Federation, and it's recognized by the rest of the world. So at the level of international law, the sovereignty of Ukraine was recognized on a planetary scale. The next time that it gets recognized, which becomes very important because of a negative lesson from this, was the Budapest Accord of 1994, where the Ukrainians agreed to turn their nuclear weapons over to Russia in exchange for a permanent promise of non-aggression, that Russia would never invade them, never threaten them. Now, this becomes really important because of a lesson that it tells the smaller countries of the world, and some of us were talking about this over dinner. The lesson it says is keep your nuclear weapons. It's a lesson that says do not denuclearize, do not turn away your weapons of mass destruction, because there are big bullies out there that may, when you turn them over, whack you. Now, for those of us that have been in the peace and justice movements, that's not the lesson that we want. We want a lesson of non-proliferation, of denuclearization. But when you have the aggression of the Russians or the aggression of the United States, the wrong lesson gets learned. And so, now, was there NATO expansion? Yes, there was. NATO should have ceased to exist in 1991. It should never have been formed, in my opinion. But it should have ceased to exist in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And there was that moment that many of us of a certain age remember when it looked like that could happen. And it didn't. And it didn't largely because of the hubris of the United States. But it also didn't happen, and it expanded because of great fear in Eastern Europe of what a new Russia was going to actually do. And so NATO begins expanding. The United States could have stopped NATO from expanding. The United States could have done a number of things, including a European security agreement, a neutralization. It could have taken a number of steps. They didn't, again, because of hubris. But the other part of this is the growing revanchism in Russia that promoted the idea of a return to some form of a Russian empire. And I would argue that would have happened regardless of whether NATO expanded, because even if Ukraine had gone into NATO, which it wasn't going to happen, the Russians would have, if the Russians would have found any explanation to have carried this out. And part of the reason we know this is all you have to do is look at the speeches that Putin offered in 2021 and 2022, where he was obsessed with the erasure of the Ukrainians. And to me, that settled the question.
So I have a follow-up question to that. Why do you think so many people in the United States, and some people in Europe too, although of course we're not in as regular contact with them, why do you think there's some people in the US left who have such trouble understanding what you just said?
Well, there's many reasons, and some I won't give on tape. But in all seriousness, I think, Barbara, that part of it is much of the left does not think in three-dimensional terms. It thinks very much in one-dimensional terms, and it thinks only in terms of the notion of one enemy at a time, and that it's not possible to have multiple opponents at any juncture. And we're so used to fighting the aggression of the United States that the idea that there might be some other aggressors, not as strong, at least not on a global scale, but other aggressors that have to be tackled. I think that there's also many people that fear that any support that's given to the Ukrainians that ends up aligning with what the US government is doing is supporting the US government. And I think that that's ahistorical. It's like I look at like what happened in World War II. In the lead up to World War II, for instance, the fascist insurrection in Spain and the German and Italian interventions, and most of the global left demanded that imperialist countries support the Spanish Republic. They demanded that the US, an imperialist country that was screwing over Latin America, that they support the Spanish Republic. There was no contradiction between fighting the US in Latin America and calling on the US to support Spain. During World War II, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor of the CIA, provided the Viet Minh with military weapons. I don't remember anyone on the left crying about that, saying, "Oh no, danger, Will Robinson." No, it's just like, no one said anything of the sort. There was a recognition that this was a good thing, even if one, for good reasons, did not trust the motives of the United States. But I think in a post-Cold War world, when we've watched US hubris, when we've watched the aftermath of 9/11, when we've watched the machinations in the Balkans, when we watched the invasion of Iraq, it's very easy to think that there can only be one opponent. And so I think that's what's at the root of it. And it leads to very dangerous politics, including a tendency towards what was once called, and is called again, red-brown alliances, where leftists and fascists unite against social democrats, liberals, etc., in the name of bringing capitalism down.
One of the reasons, sorry for being hoarse, I always am at this time of day. One of the reasons I was drawn to being involved with the Ukraine Solidarity Network is because Bill was involved, and because we had worked together in the past, and because I knew, how principled his politics were. I thought, oh, okay, so that's an okay place for me to be. I recently did a Democracy Now! Episode with Medea Benjamin, who has very different perspectives about these matters, and also has gotten a lot of publicity and a lot of visibility around her perspectives, which are widely held. The perspectives that Bill and I have, and that the Ukraine Solidarity Capital District has, and that the Ukraine Solidarity Network has, are the minority position within the U.S. left. And for some of us, we're fine with that, because we're used to not being the popular people, you know? I always say, wasn't popular in junior high school, not popular now, what difference does it make, you know? Because you have to stand on the side of ethics and principle. The other thing, one of the things that I saw, I try not to read the comments, this was portrayed as not just portrayed, when I was called by Democracy Now!, I was asked to participate in a civil debate. I said, that's no problem, because I only do civil, you know, so it's not like I'm going to have to stretch to try to be civil on one particular day, you know. So in any event, I try not to look at the comments, but several weeks later I did, and a person wrote in, I never thought I would see Barbara Smith advocate for weapons to continue a war. And like I said, okay, that's, yeah, you never thought you'd see that, okay. I've been involved in anti-war organizing since I was in college, and we were struggling to end the war in Vietnam, and I got involved before it was a popular movement. I got involved in the 1960s, the mid-late 1960s. So in any event, and I've been involved in every anti-war movement since that time. But when I talk about the situation in Ukraine, I talk about how there's kind of a Venn diagram or whatever, of like, sometimes that Venn diagram, when it intersects interests or phenomena or whatever you're looking at in the Venn diagram are the same. The fact that the U.S. government has its own diabolical interest for the world in general and for Ukraine in particular doesn't mean that the Ukrainian people do not have a right to get weapons, because that's what the Ukrainian people want to do. As far as we understand, they wish to continue to fight to maintain their autonomy and the integrity of their homeland. And who are we to say, sitting over in the United States, you don't have a right to do that? And as we've also discussed, there's no socialist country, social democratic country that is a world power, a superpower that has weapons to offer. We don't have that country that they could get the weapons from. So anyway, I digress.
No. Let me just say something about
Yes.
it. So Medea Benjamin is a friend of mine. Now some people object to that. They say, how can you? Well, I can disagree with people. As long as they don't have a knife pointed at me, which some people do. You know, I can accept that. Medea's a pacifist. I'm not. And also, she has a different view of the United States and Russia, and is drawn to the notion of a multipolar world. Now, this is the term that's become very popular recently, the idea being that we've lived through a unipolar world of US dominance. So with the growth of other powers, Russia, China, etc., that this creates a greater environment where particularly smaller countries can begin to flourish. I think that that's wrong. We've lived through multipolar worlds. August 1914 was one of the heights of a multipolar world. September 1939 was, again, one of the heights of a multipolar world. There was no hegemon. I think we need a non-polar world. It's very different. What we don't need is what's called a codominium. You know, we don't need a situation where there are certain superpowers or large powers that are dominating over the rest of us. But I think that, with all due respect, Medea believes that that would be a better world, and I think she also completely underestimates the danger of the Putin regime, as do many other people on the U.S. left and progressive movements. They are closing their eyes to the murder, I mean, you don't want to be anywhere near a window if you're in Moscow. You know, I mean, they're ignoring Chechnya. You know, it's like when I'm looking at Gaza, I think about Chechnya. You know, I look at Gaza, I think about what has happened in Syria. I look at Gaza, I think about what's happened in Ukraine. And, you know, you see this level of devastation, and the Russians in particular had played a devastating role, genocidal, I would argue, in Chechnya, in Ukraine, and in Syria. And yet there's this denial, because there's this notion that what people will say is the US is the main enemy. And well, I said, well, okay, but main doesn't mean the only enemy, last time I checked. And so if they're not the only enemy, then the question is, what do you do with other enemies? And Medea doesn't have a really good response for that.
Right.
And I've been very disappointed. So we can agree on certain things, like opposing Morocco and Western Sahara and US aid to Morocco. We can agree on that, and any number of other things. But this divide, this is a global divide that we've been witnessing within left and progressive circles that has emerged about Ukraine. And it's only temporarily covered over by the response to the Gaza war. Only temporarily, because there are deeper issues which, if we have time, we can get into.
And you're having just said that, and thank you so much for everything that you shared already. We are going to have a time for a Q&A. So I'm sure, I mean, this is a provocative enough and also informative enough conversation. I'm sure that you have comments and questions too. We will keep those, you know, each person, you know, so we can have as many as possible. We're asking for questions and comments, not, well, you know the alternative. We wrote, you and I, we wrote an article together with Don Rojas earlier this year, and the title of the article is Why African Americans Should Support Ukraine. Can you say more about this topic? Some black people see Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a, quote, white people's problem, end quote, that has nothing to do with the black struggle. And when I say we wrote it, full disclosure, Bill wrote the draft, and then he shared it with Don and with me. And I love drafts. I mean, I love other people's drafts. And so I did what I could, you know, and so did Don. And the thing is, but Bill gave us a draft we could work with, and yet all of our names went on it. So that was nice. And we may write another article together like that, too.
We. Great. No, it was good, and it was a collective effort. So there's a few answers to this. One is that many people don't realize Ukraine was a training ground for many African revolutionaries during the period of the USSR. And this is one of the reasons that when I hear certain people like the opportunistic leadership in South Africa say, well, you know, we have a lot to thank Russia for in terms of the anti-apartheid struggle. Well, you have a lot to thank the Soviet Union for, and you actually have a lot to thank the Ukrainians for. Because a lot, that was like one of the base areas in terms of training some of the people that went on to lead the ANC. So that's one reason. Second reason is that black people need to always be on the side of those fighting colonialism and aggression. When we look at a history of the African world, and we look at the side that most black internationalists have been on, it's always been in opposition to aggression. This is not a white people's conflict. One of the things that can happen in the United States, and it happens a lot to African Americans, is that we look at the world quite understandably through the eyes exclusively of people here in the United States. So we think about race, for example, in terms of color. And so then when you say to people, well, actually, you know, race started more or less when the Spanish took over all of the Iberian Peninsula, and they'd started driving out the Moors and the Jews, and when the English invaded Ireland, and they declared the indigenous Irish to be an inferior race. I've been to Ireland, I know what color people are. There was no color issue there. So when we're looking at things, it's not just through matters of color or the way that we look at race in the United States. It is about oppression, and national oppression, and a certain form of racist oppression. I would argue that the colonial approach of Russia towards Ukraine mirrors to a great deal that of Britain towards Ireland. That it's not about color. It's the difference between the British relationship to Scotland versus Ireland. So the relationship of Britain to Scotland was ultimately, they merged monarchies, they absorbed them. But with Ireland, they went through the total suppression of the indigenous people. And they did certain things, like making their language illegal, if that sounds familiar. Displacing people from land. Removing weapons. I mean, a number of things that sound really deeply familiar. And it wasn't about color. So there's aspects to what we're witnessing that it's not like it's a battle between Belarus and Poland or something. With all due respect to Poles and Belarusians, it's interesting, Barbara, because even like some people will make a World War I reference, and they'll talk about how there was an imperialist war, etc., and that the good left stood against any imperialist war. But what a lot of people on the left forget is that Lenin, who obviously was very much against imperialist war, took a very interesting stand towards the invasion and occupation of Belgium. And basically said that it was right to oppose the invasion and occupation of Belgium in the context of an imperialist war. Right? Nevertheless, saying that this occupation was wrong. So there are times when we have to simply step forward and say, no, there's this criminal aggression, we've got to take a stand against that. And so I think that this is of critical importance to African Americans. And I think in part because we have frequently a wrong lens, we as African Americans, in looking at things in strictly black-white binary. We miss a lot of things, and we misinterpret. So many of us looked at the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa as almost an extension of the black freedom struggle from the United States. And looked at some of the tactics, but also the demands against apartheid as being very similar to Jim Crow, fighting Jim Crow. And that's true, there's similarities. But because of the way that we were looking at things, in the same year that South Africa became free, we were totally unprepared for the Rwanda genocide. Totally. And most African American leaders failed to speak out on the Rwanda genocide. Right? There were no white people there. I mean, I would say to folks, if 100 Belgian paratroopers had landed in Kigali and murdered 1,000 Rwandans, we would have burned down the Belgian embassy in a heartbeat. But when you had nearly 1 million Tutsis and their Hutu allies murdered in 90 days by another African people, people didn't know how to respond. And I think that that's also part of what we're up against, Barbara. We have to broaden the lens and look at politics not through the eyes of a black-white binary.
It's really hard. I so agree with all that you just laid out so expertly. It's really hard to share and to convey that perspective, particularly in black context.
Yes.
I think that as an oppressed group, some people would say nation, you know, a colony within an internal colony, that's one of the ways of analyzing the position of African Americans and other black people in the United States, in a white supremacist country. It's really hard to take stands that put you on the outside of one's birth community.
Yes.
We could talk about race and stuff, we could swerve the whole conversation and we'd be here for the rest of the day, if not the night, talking about the complexities of it. But I'll just stick with the thing I just said, that it's hard for us as African Americans, you and me, to take stances that put us on the outs with our birth communities. And people will say, you know, I love this. And if you didn't know, and I love saying it, love letting people know what my real profession is. My real profession is teaching African American studies, specifically literature on the college level. My last position was at the College of St. Rose. I was a scholar in residence at Brooklyn College this spring. So that's what I know about more than anything else, and certainly more about that than global politics. Bill has a very well-known black literary figure in his family, and he mentioned his name, and as soon as he mentioned his name, now this is somebody from the 19th century, right? As soon as he said his name, I said, oh yeah, he's a writer, right? How did I know that? Because I'm a literature nerd, you know? Be that as it may, I digress. But one of the things that black people talk about, or that are not black people, a number of people talk about, people of different groups talk about, is that there's no scientific basis for race. All well and good. What we know is that all humans really are descended from the, the original Eve, who was an a woman living in what is now understood and known to be Africa. So all of us in this room have that lineage, because all Homo sapiens come from that original individual woman who was a woman located in Africa. Whether she's an African or not, before the countries or the continents had names, who knows? But be that as it may, that's all true. We also know that racial differences are very much a matter of climate and geographic location. So that when you live in a very hot climate, like Africa, on a consistent millennium by millennium basis, at a certain point, you're going to adjust. The animals and the humans are going, and the plants, everything's going to adjust to that environment. And having melanin, as much as possible, is protective against sun, against skin cancer, against all kinds of things. I could go on, but this is mixed company, so I will not go on. We'll talk about it at lunch. Another adaptation to the African climate. We'll talk about it at lunch. And if anybody ever wants to know, just DM me or whatever. I'll let you in on that. But these are actual physical adaptations to climate. And of course, if you live in a cold climate, like in Europe and in other places, although we see indigenous populations, in like the northern Arctic, that obviously something else was happening there. But then there's the land bridge, the land bridge theories of like where indigenous people came from. So be that as it may, not scientific, why can't we all just get along? What's real is racial oppression. That's what's real. What's real is racial oppression, and also the social, political, and economic status that evolves from and that flows from perceived racial identity. That's what's real. So we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of those problems. I wish that we could get more people of African heritage living in the United States, because those are people we run into and who we live with. I wish we could get more of them to understand why having an internationalist perspective about these politics is really important. And I have to say,
we have to,
yeah, sorry.
See, we have to, there's a long history of black internationalism that goes beyond Pan-Africanism, that goes back to the 19th century. Actually, you could argue, as I have, goes back to the age of pirates, and that's not a joke. But certainly in the 19th century. And I first discovered this when I was doing some research on something that was called the Negro Convention movements, which preceded the Civil War. And they were these annual, semi-annual gatherings of black activists from the northern states. And I stumbled across these resolutions for the freedom of Ireland. And I said, what? And consistently, and if you look at African American history from the 1830s on, what you will see is an identification with the Irish freedom struggle. You see it in the 19th century, you see it in Marcus Garvey, and expression of solidarity, the anti-British struggle in Ireland. See it on and on. And what happens is that black internationalism that expands beyond dealing with black folks is often suppressed or trivialized. It's consistent that basically we're told this is not something that you guys should be participating in, and we even have voices within our own communities. When I've been involved around the issue of Ireland, I've had people of African descent saying, why are you doing this? There's so many issues facing black people. Why are you spending time with some white folks, right? And it's that kind of narrowness that we're up against. So we've got to have these kind of discussions.
We also saw it when Queen Elizabeth departed the earthly plane, and on social media, that's some of the funniest social media posts, because I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok. And of course, well, I don't do too much on Facebook, but be that as it may, I'm on them. And there's some that I'm not on, WhatsApp, whatever those are. Be that as it may, what I saw, when Queen Elizabeth died, was such great Irish, black, and other people of color solidarity that was global.
Yeah.
And my favorite, one of my favorite tweets was when, and there's more than one person who said this, it was black people saying, just let the Irish people have it. They've been at this for far longer than we have, and they are definitely, their remarks, because Twitter is a lot about clever remarks, and short takes. They basically said, let them have it. They're winning, and we can only admire them, and how sharp and funny they're being about the demise of this individual who's actually responsible, at least symbolically, for much of the things that have been wrong since, since those
for 500 years.
Yeah, I was just going to say, was it the Tudors, was it Stuarts? I don't know who they were, but be that as it may, it's been a very long time of bad acts, very long time. You're also very involved in organizing concerning sub-Saharan Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share something in Western Africa? Western Sahara, I should say. Can you share something about that work and how you see the situation in Africa and other places in the global south connecting to what is going on in Ukraine and also in Palestine?
I've been thinking about, we need to have an anti-occupation international. And I mean that quite seriously, that there's, whether we're dealing with Western Sahara, whether we're dealing with Palestine, frankly, whether we're dealing with Northern Ireland, whether we're dealing with Ukraine, that West Papua, that there is a commonality in these struggles that needs to be elevated. And we need to show, for example, that what's going on in Gaza is not unique. This is horrendous. This is absolutely the case. What the Russians are doing in Syria and Ukraine is horrendous. And what the Turks are doing to the Kurds in northern Syria, right? So there's a need for an anti-occupation international. There needs to be collaboration in elevating these struggles. Because one of the things that happens, Barbara, is that it's because of the way the media works, all these struggles disappear. So we went through 2 years that the only thing you'd hear about was Ukraine. That's it. Not about Western Sahara, not even about Palestine. Now we hear about Gaza. You don't hear anything about Ukraine. You have to go searching. You almost have to go to Wikipedia to get information now, right? And you don't, nothing on Western Sahara, nothing on West Papua. And so part of what we have to do is change the discussion. And in our advocacy around Ukraine, for instance, is making the parallels with what's going on in Western Sahara, making the parallels with what's going on with the Palestinians, etc., so that you raise people's, their interest, you tweak their interest, their curiosity. We've got to go beyond these one-off situations. The other thing is that we cannot be taken in by the notion that the enemy of our enemy is our friend. How many of you knew that there was an anti-Japanese movement in the United States before World War, a pro-Japanese movement in the United States before World War II?
Pro?
Right? Okay. And before World War II, and that this movement had a base within Black America. How many of you knew that? Okay. This is a classic example of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. When the Japanese kicked the ass of the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, it sent ripples around the planet because all of a sudden this white colonizer had been thoroughly defeated. I mean, this wasn't just by accident. The Japanese destroyed the Russian fleet, they completely demoralized the Russian army, etc. And around the world, people were saying, wow, look at this. The colored races are emerging. And Japanese imperialism made good use of this to promote itself as the vanguard of the darker races. And that became a very popular thing, including in the United States, that you had a growing interest within the United States, within Black America, with the Japanese. One example that may come as a surprise is W.B. Du Bois. That Du Bois was contemptuous of China, talking in the 30s, because China had been such a victim of Western imperialism that he, in effect, thought of them as chumps. But the Japanese, in his mind, had stood up to the West. And he even went so far as to support the Japanese puppet regime Manchukuo, what is Manchuria, right? Which came as a complete shock to me because, well, it just came as a complete shock to me. It was only when World War II really breaks up that Du Bois' views changed on that. The pro-Japanese movement, one of the legacies of the pro-Japanese movement is the Nation of Islam. And the Elijah Muhammad in the 1930s was one of those who was pro-Japanese. Why? Because they looked at the Japanese as fighting against white world supremacy. And the Japanese were very convincing in their message, not just here, but in Asia. They were able to gain significant allies by suggesting that they were themselves the enemies of white world supremacy. So they got Aguinaldo, the hero of the Philippine Revolution, who becomes one of the puppet leaders when the Japanese take over the Philippines. Sukarno played patty cake with them in Indonesia, right? And others did too. The communists were consistently against the Japanese. But a lot of these other nationalists weren't. And they fell into the enemy of my enemy was my friend. One of the premier leaders of the Indian National Liberation Movement sided with the Japanese and set up a military unit to fight alongside the Japanese against the British. And you can understand it, it's not irrational. It was just wrong. It was completely misunderstanding the nature of the enemy. And that's part of the problem that we have, that there's some forces in the global south that are looking at countries like Russia as maybe not their idol, but they're looking at them as not all that significant. And this is where there's a tremendous mistake that's being made, and it's why I think that our message, Barbara, has to be conveyed not just in the US, but globally.
I'm going to combine the last two questions that are related so that we can get to conversation with everyone here. Since October 7th, there have been both accurate and inaccurate comparisons of the war in Ukraine to the war in Israel-Palestine, especially in relation to US military funding, aid. Can you talk about how you see these two conflicts? And then finally, to get to the title of our session and our event today, how do we talk about the situation in Ukraine in the post-October 7th political landscape?
So, Biden has made such a terrible mistake. And that's because he's a Zionist. And he believes in what he's doing, despite the fact that he is alienating a huge portion of the domestic electorate and alienating much of the global south. And he's making the wrong comparison. There is a relationship, and Russia is to Ukraine what Israel is to the Palestinians. And this goes back to what I was saying about anti-occupation, that the October 7th attack by Hamas, the killing of civilians, was a war crime. And I have no problem saying that, despite the fact that I am very pro-Palestinian, and have been since I was nearly 15 years old. But taking down civilians is a war crime. It's an internationally recognized war crime. And there's no point, morally or politically, in being ambiguous about that. And what we have been seeing from the Israeli side, both preceding October 7th and following October 7th, have been one humanitarian or human rights abuse after another, one war crime after another. The fact that a Israeli government official would threaten to nuke Gaza and didn't get summarily executed for making such a suggestion tells us really all we need to know about the rabid nature of the regime. And the Netanyahu forces are making it clear that all bets are off in terms of what will ultimately happen. That is, whether the Palestinians will be erased from Gaza, whether there'll be a permanent occupation, whether there'll be a puppet regime that's put in. But in the meantime, they have no problem with their atrocities. One of the things I've noticed about Israeli atrocities over the years is that they're always accompanied by an asterisk. And the asterisk is an apology for the collateral damage that was done. And I remember that when there were Palestinian suicide bombers, someone made a perverse joke, but it makes the point, that the suicide bombers, after carrying, the organizations that sponsor them, after carrying out a bombing, should say, we didn't intend to kill the people, we just intended to destroy the buses. The people got in the way. That is, in effect, what the Israelis say time and again, when they kill one after another of the Palestinians. There is always an excuse. There's always a rationale. They're very smooth. They always have their spokespersons who can speak like they came from Brooklyn, right? And so that US audiences will hear them and it will resonate. One atrocity after another, and people accept it. Because no one's doing anything about it. Just as in Russia and Ukraine, the Russians are carrying out one atrocity after another, and much of the world sits back. And what makes it even more horrendous is that when you have people on the left that are silent in the face of genocide, or excuse it away. So there is a parallel. And it's we should uphold the right parallel, which is that acts of aggression, acts of occupation, atrocities must be opposed. We should also oppose all war crimes. You know, the US was on the right side in World War II, but the bombing of Dresden was a war crime. The US was on the right side, but the bombing of Yokohama was a war crime. The US was on the right side, but the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima were war crimes. You call it as it is. You don't qualify it. You don't say, well, you got to understand, you know, yes, the Germans did this, and, you know, basically shit happens. No, it doesn't work that way. And so we're the ones that need to be standing firm on these things. And that's where you and I have stood together against some of our colleagues who, you know, haven't really wanted to come out and say, no, October 7th, that wasn't just a military assault. You know, when you start whacking civilians, it takes on a different character. If Hamas and others had simply carried out a military assault against military targets on October 7th, we'd be having a very different discussion right now. Choosing civilian targets changes the discussion, as it has in Ukraine. And one of the things, leaving the morality aside for a second, when you start whacking civilians, you are creating permanent enemies. It now becomes a blood feud. It's no longer just a war. Right? People expect in war, folks are going to die. Soldiers, combatants are going to die. When you start taking down people's families, this changes the equation. And it makes peace that much more difficult. And so, like, for our friends like Medea, who will say there needs to be a ceasefire in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians need to stop fighting, well, how's that going to happen? I mean, let's just be real. How is that going to happen unless the Russians are the ones that stop fighting? Unless it's the Russians that pull back from their aggression, right? After the number of Ukrainian families that have been wiped out through these missile attacks, these things that are in absolute violation of international law. Absolutely. No question. How can we expect the Ukrainians just to say, well, you know, tomorrow will be a brighter day, right? It doesn't work that way. And we shouldn't expect the Palestinians are going to be any different. They're just as human as the Ukrainians. And they are going to continue to feel the anger and the fury they've been feeling for 75 plus years.
I think that concludes our part of this, and now we'd love to hear from you. One of the things I said to Bill is that he and I, of course, are from the 20th century, as are many people in this room. I would say most of us are from the 20th century. We spent most of our lives in the 20th century. We're here in the 21st, but we're not products of the 21st century. So we have a different perspective about life. And I know I can see my friend, friends laughing about that, but particularly Yvette. But the thing is that when I say that, I'm talking specifically about us as black people from the 20th century, because my feeling is that I was born about 80 years, actually 81 years after the Civil War ended. Only 81 years. That's a human lifespan. So I was born 81 years after the Civil War ended. My grandmother, who raised my sister and me, with many other, relatives and extended family, but she was our primary caretaker for certainly of the first, 12, 14 years of our life. She was born in 1886. So she was born about 21 years after the Civil War ended. So therefore, even though they never talked about it, the environment I was raised in, those values and those experiences were palpable without them being discussed. And one of the things I think that we were exposed to, I'm talking about my sister and me and probably Bill too, was this incredible humanity, because given the terrors, the horrors that people who were living in proximity to the experience of chattel slavery, why in the world was there not a bloodbath following the Civil War? I mean, in the southern states, black people far outnumbered white people. And the Civil War was over, slavery was officially ended, at least on the books. Why was there not a wholesale bloodbath? And that was not what happened. If there was carnage, it was the other way around. Excuse me, but like our 21st century siblings and family members have different experiences. But you know, we continue to try. We speak out about anti-Semitism, and we also speak out against Islamophobia. And it's a very, you know, it's a type, you know, like a high wire act, you know, of walking, you know, on that, you know, that, whatever they call those things when you're up on the little tightrope. A tightrope, yes. I couldn't even think about it because the thought is so frightening of being on such a thing, up on such a thing. But yeah, we're walking a tightrope in our politics. And having said that, what would people like to share with us, and with Bill in particular? What are your comments and your questions? Yes.
So I have a question going back to, you talked about how, you know, there's a certain segment of the American left that are, I don't know if you would say pro-Russian, but at least, you know, are taking the Russian point of view that, you know, they're it's almost like they're the victims, you know. Russia's the victim of U.S. aggression and imperialism. And I don't think, there's, you know, I think there is some truth to that, but they also don't see the other part of it, which you said is, you know, the long history between Russia and Ukraine. But one thing that has come up a lot, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it, is that group, I don't know what you want to call them, I guess campus is the word, they harp on this idea of Ukrainian Nazism, you know, and Ukrainian Nazis, and that, you know, this is, and I'm just, or ultranationalists. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Thank you.
Yeah. There are Nazis in Ukraine. There's Nazis in Albany. And there's Nazis in Florida. And in Russia. And one of the things that is very strange, I'm glad you posed the question, is there is a blindness to the right-wing forces in Russia. And so the Putin regime, in connection with the invasion of Ukraine, has been able to create a veil, in some ways, over some of that. But the Putin regime itself is quite white supremacist, male supremacist, and a form of Christian nationalism. And so there's nothing progressive about the Putin regime, which is one of the reasons that I'm struck when I hear certain US leftists rise to the defense of the Russians. There is a very articulated fascist theory that's known as Eurasianism, that is the prevailing ideology of the Putin regime. So the focus on Nazis in Ukraine, there are Nazis there, and there's no question about it. During World War II, the US military was completely segregated until the Battle of the Bulge. And you had white units that either failed to support black soldiers or attacked them in the United States. You had open white supremacists. George Patton, for example, right? So it's like that, it's like welcome to the real world, as Morpheus would say. And that's the real world. The Nazis in Ukraine, electorally, are insignificant. But you do have military units who have come forward and have fought against the Russians. You also have these strange Russian units that have defected to Ukraine to fight against Russia that do not have good progressive politics, but they are against the Russian invasion for a whole set of reasons. So it's this one-sided view of Russia, and I can't figure out the blindness, because the facts of the situation are so obvious, yet there's just this denial. And when you push back, it really comes down to, well, but the US is really behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So the argument really is that the Ukrainians are not really people, they're dupes.
They're puppets.
Right, exactly.
I saw this gentleman's hand.
I really appreciate your comments on Central Africa and Russia's involvement there, because most people just goes over their head.
Yes.
The coup in Niger and the rest of the coups all the way from Sudan to Timbuktu have all been instigated or aided by the Wagner Group, which, when you talk about Nazis, it is Russia's Nazi military on a private level. In fact, when Putin had that plane crash, the second in command of Wagner was a diehard religious, truly religious Nazi. That was his religion.
Mm-hmm.
And, and Wagner definitely had a lot of people who have the complete insignias all across their bodies for fighting in those regiments. So people don't understand that this is Putin's way of manipulating what's going on in Central Africa. And in terms of the Nazi presence in Ukraine, it's true. When Hitler was going to attack Russia, some people were already oppressed by the Russians for 2 decades or more, and they decided that that was their way out. But where the Nazi element existed prior to this invasion was at the Azov Battalion, if you know, in Mariupol. It was a weirder kind of group where they were kind of very patriotic, but some of their symbolism echoed that. But for the most part, Ukraine has a Muslim Tartar as its Secretary of Defense. It has a Jewish president. It's probably the most diverse of any Eastern European country, administration and military. So you can't say that it's pro-Nazi at all. And you can then look at Putin, who's idolized fascism for years.
That's correct. But let me differ with you a little bit. One thing, in terms of the coups in Africa, they were largely anti-French. That's what drove them. The French relationship to a number of their former colonies, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, has been really horrendous, and they've supported these terrible regimes. So a combination of the role of the French as well as internal strange politics within the ruling groups there, plus being able to make use of Russian mercenaries, fuses. These were not popular revolutions, although in some cases they got a lot of popular support initially because they were anti-French. They were focused that way. So I don't think that the Wagner Group incited them, but I think that the Wagner Group exploited the situation. The second thing is that when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, one of the biggest mistakes that they made was not embracing Ukrainian supporters who wanted to join hands with them for a variety of reasons. Now, some of those reasons were people were anti-Stalin, in some cases they were anti-Soviet, but in another case, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot in Ukraine. Deep hatred of Jews. And there were folks that wanted to. And if the Nazis hadn't been so anti-Slav, they probably would have been able to enlist many battalions of Ukrainians. But all of a sudden the Ukrainians realized, oh, these people don't like us either, right? And you had essentially a civil war almost that broke out in Ukraine. And the Germans were largely defeated because of Ukrainians. The Ukrainians of any population within the USSR lost a disproportionate number of people fighting the Germans. But there was a lot. There were a lot of people that were pro-Nazi. There's no question about it. But you're right about the current situation, and so this history is being used to misrepresent the present, and that's the thing that we've got to understand. And so you don't have to like the Azov Battalion. I don't like the Azov Battalion. They're fighting the Russians. Good. Let them fight the Russians. But the character of the administration there is not a Nazi regime. And you'll get some people on the left, and I just had this the other day with someone attacking me for supporting the Zelensky and describing Zelensky as a Nazi, and it's like, leaving aside Zelensky's Jewish, just leave that aside for a second. He got democratically elected. What about old Vladimir? You know, what would we say about his last election? You know, I mean, it just, so that's the only asterisk I'd put after your remarks.
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for this discussion. I wanted to ask a couple of questions that I think maybe could be related to each other. The first was, I really like the idea of an anti-occupation international, and you were talking about various situations, and I wanted to see what your thoughts might be about Nagorno-Karabakh and the Azeri-Armenian conflict, since it has the Soviet, post-Soviet context that Ukraine and Russia have. And then I listened to I read the interview the debate with Medea Benjamin, and Barbara, you had brought up that Marjorie Taylor Greene was kind of like doing selfies with somebody from Code Pink. Anyways, this is kind of a Red-Brown Alliance light. And so I was just wondering if you could talk more about that, because in the end, I consider myself, I guess, I identify as on the left, but it's these extreme right people that really are responsible for taking away the support for Ukraine, the military support. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more about the Red-Brown alliances. And I know that was a very big, complex couple of questions, so thank you.
And I know we started a little bit late, but we want to be respectful of people's time, given that there are at least 2 other events that I'm aware of that are happening today that people may indeed be involved in. But before that happens, there is one key question that I will be asking before most people leave, I hope.
What time are we ending?
1 o'clock?
1? Okay.
Oh,
I don't know.
I thought we had the room.
No, we
Until
need to be out of the
1.
room at 1.
Pardon me?
We should be out of the room at 1.
Yeah, so I didn't think we were going until
Yeah.
1 o'clock. I
Quarter
thought,
of, or
no,
maybe a
no,
little before.
there's no way I thought we were going until 1 o'clock, so.
So if everyone helps with the chairs, we can end at 12:59.
No, we'll be ending before that too.
Okay. So I'm not a specialist on at all on Armenia and Azerbaijan. What I can say is that this is a legacy of the way that these nations were constructed under the USSR. And I'm not saying that to criticize that. There was an attempt, particularly in the 1930s, that was called national territorial delimitation, to create nation states among peoples that may or may not have been considered nations. And there was an attempt to create borders and to create autonomous areas, etc. And you end up having this zone that is primarily Armenian, that's right smack in the middle of Azerbaijan. And this becomes a problem. And so on the one hand, internationally recognized borders of Azerbaijan include that region, Nagorno-Karabakh, as part of Azerbaijan. But it's a predominantly Armenian region. And what the Azerbaijanis did was essentially carry out a blitzkrieg. And it wasn't simply that they militarily destroyed the Armenian units there. They basically destroyed the proto-state that was there and have threatened ethnic cleansing. So on the one hand, one could make an argument that territory should have been theirs. I'm not saying that necessarily, but the way that you go about doing that is not through ethnic cleansing. And what we should have seen through the Balkan Wars is what happens when you go for ethnic cleansing and when you go for the creation of nation states on an ethno-national basis as opposed to a territorial. The issue, see, I think you're right. I think that it's important to understand, and I've been saying this within the Ukraine Solidarity Network, that we need to be talking a lot more. Let me put it like this. There are people on the left and progressives who have bad positions on Ukraine. And and without mentioning any names, their importance is not worth a hill of beans. They're an annoyance. Then there are people on the right who do have power. And they, much like their ideological ancestors of the 1930s, are embracing a certain form of isolationism. It's not real isolationism, because there's never been isolationism in the United States. It's, we don't want to be bound by any treaty view, and a certain kind of love for right-wing authoritarian movements in Europe. And so, you know, our dear friend in Georgia, the Congresswoman, she is one of those who embraces right-wing authoritarianism. And so her alleged isolationism, or whatever you want to call it, is ideologically has nothing to do with the point of view that's taken by Medea Benjamin. Medea is not a fascist. She's wrong. She's not a fascist. Marjorie Taylor Greene and others, there's something else, right? And I think we need to make that distinction. And that we need to be focusing on how to destabilize the strategy of these semi-fascist, post-fascist, neo-fascist, all of them, right? And that's what I think we really need to be focusing on. If a Jamu Baraka or Medea Benjamin want to wage a polemic against me, they can do it. They can waste their time. I'm not going to be responding. I think we need to be thinking about, what do we do about these right-wing folks? Because they are very dangerous. That's right.
That's why it's so dangerous.
So before these particular friends leave, there's a couple of things I want to say. One is that I find it very disturbing that Medea and Code Pink, more the organization than the individual, that they would align with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, because there are other things that, of course, many other things that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene stand for, like white supremacy,
That's right.
like homophobia, like transphobia, like misogyny, like the attack on women's reproductive freedom, that are just insupportable and cannot be justified. So that's something to think about, like, you know, can you really be a feminist peace organization and line up with people who are opposed to every single thing? And then the books, make sure you
Yes.
get the flyers for the books, good? Because I'm just getting ready to do, I'm getting ready to do the commercial for the books.
Oh, yeah. This is very important.
Right, this is very important. And before anyone else leaves, let me try to explain what's going on here. We are in a house of books. It's called a library. However, because it is a free public library, which is a bastion of democracy, and also because libraries and schools are under attack and books are being censored, nevertheless, we are not able to sell books in a library space. And Bill, the last question was, why did you decide to write 2 wonderful mystery novels? Among other things, because Bill is a noted author about labor issues primarily, and This Is the Man Who Fell from the Sky is published in 2018. I have just finished it, and I'm so glad I haven't finished this one, because it's lovely to have something to look forward to. This is The Man Who Changed Colors.
Yeah,
And these are mystery novels with a black Cape Verdean protagonist who is a journalist, and he gets involved in mysteries in which there is much danger unfolds. So here are flyers, carefully made by me, here are flyers, at least duplicated by me, that are for Bill's books, plural, for his books, plural. And then also, I had 2 new books come out in October, but they're not actually new. They're 40th anniversary and 25th anniversary of some old chestnuts. Homegirls and The Truth That Never Hurt. So please pick those up and please order. When you order Bill's books, say that you would love for them to be audiobooks.
That's right.
We were talking about this last night, and we would like these books to be audiobooks. It's not clear to the publisher that this would be a money-making enterprise. So whether you use audiobooks or not, please, when you order, do ask about the audiobooks and say how much you'd love to have an audiobook for some of your friends who do not necessarily read print books. This is the last book I'm going to show to you, which is a children's book, one of my favorite areas of reading, children's books. And it's called The Light She Feels Inside. It's about a little black girl who both feels happy and warm with, like the fire of happiness and passion, etc. And then she also gets very angry, and that feels like she's getting hot too. And so this person who wrote this wonderful book is a book really about black women's history, and it's for ages 4 and up, which is just perfect for my sister and me. Just perfect. And she actually includes a page about the Combahee River Collective, which is a black feminist, the socialist feminist, black feminist, lesbian organization of which I was a part of in Boston in the 1970s. So I know that you are looking for gifts for the little people, the younger people in your life. I know that you are. So I'm going to put this book back on the table, and you might take down the title because I think that they would enjoy it. So that's a book thing. But Bill,
Yes.
Tell me, why did you decide to write these mystery novels?
A few reasons. I love stories. I've made up stories in my head since I was a kid. Barbara mentioned a relative of mine. His name was William Stanley Braithwaite. He was a premier pre-Harlem Renaissance poet, anthologist, literary figure, an autodidact who developed a reputation of being the terror of Boston because he could make or break people's literary careers in the early part of the 20th century. And he was partly responsible for the rise of this guy you may have heard of named Robert Frost.
Oh, well, merely.
Right? And he and my great-grandfather was very fond of Frost until a certain thing happened and just disappeared. And Frost was later interviewed and was asked, what did you owe William Stanley Braithwaite? And he responded, I don't owe that nigger anything. Yeah, they did.
A typical American of his
Yes.
time, in other words.
And have you ever heard of Lovecraft?
HP.
Right? He polemicized against my great-grandfather when he found out that my great-grandfather was black. You can look this up, and it's just outrageous. Well, I channel my great-grandfather in certain ways, although our politics are quite different. And I have this love of writing. If I'm not writing, I'm not breathing. And so I've mainly written nonfiction. But I chose to use the venue of fiction. The first time I tried was unsuccessful with a manuscript and then these two books, because I wanted to convey political messages in a way that's fun to read. And there's such a long history of leftists in fiction, you know, and murder mysteries. I mean, for God's sakes, you know, Dashiell Hammett, right? Walter Mosley. I mean, the list goes on of people, and the whole film noir genre, which was very left. And one of the reasons it ended was because of the Cold War, because all of those writers got purged. But all of that inspired me. And so I decided to take a chance after I got the approval of my wife and my daughter.
Other people who run your life.
That's right. I was, because see, the first time I wrote a manuscript, an agent I went to ridiculed it and told me at the end, when you go back to writing nonfiction, call me. And so, but I was blunted but not stopped. And then I developed another idea which became The Man Who Fell from the Sky. And I went to my wife and daughter, and I told them the basic outlines of the story, and my daughter said, Dad, you have a story here, and maybe even two. And my wife nodded her head, and I went to it. Unfortunately, I found a publisher, which a lot of people don't. So I encourage you, if you're into murder mysteries, get at least one copy of the book and tell your friends. It's really important because it's if you're not published by a major publisher, it's hard to get reviews. There's sort of like a version of payola that's out there, which I didn't know about. You know, I just figured I'll get a review somewhere, and no. If it's like if your publisher doesn't buy ads, you're less likely to get reviews from those outlets. And so my publisher's a small publisher, so I have to rely on word of mouth and social media.
Publishing has really changed since I was a publisher, because we got loads of reviews and we took very few ads.
Yes.
And we could not afford to take ads in the
Right.
publications in which some of our books were reviewed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what's happened. That's what happened with us.
Yeah, that's astonishing,
Yeah.
Yes, so you must do that. I know, since I have a number of friends in this room, I know that some of you read, some of you read all the time, just like I do, but also you read mysteries. And one of the people who does that is Honorable Dominic Castellero, who who served on our Common Council. That's my buddy.
Okay.
And I actually bought Bill's books for Dominic, and after he finished them, he gave them to me. And I said, well, you know, I always underline in my books. And he said, well, they're your books, you bought them. So anyway, it's really fun for me. And the books are really wonderful. I mean, I'm saying both, even though I haven't started the second one. But the thing is, the second one's you probably even think it's better than the first.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so the first one's wonderful, so the second one's wonderful, and so well written.
Thank you.
I mean, he's just moves you along, you know, I'm flipping pages, you know, because I can't wait to see what happens next. The first one takes place on Cape Cod, where I spent a lot of time, and, you know, just like whenever somebody turns onto Route 6 or Route 28, it's like, oh, righty there. So it's fun. I think that we may have one more question about Oh, my goodness.
We can do
Oh,
those two.
oh, we can do a few?
Yeah, and
Okay,
then just
okay,
take
so
them.
Olena?
Yes, thank you. I would like to say a couple of words about Azov and respond to situation in Karabakh.
And speak up, Olena, so everybody can hear.
What kind of most Ukrainian standpoint and what is our analytics says, and I agree with this, that is why I'm saying, let me start with a sentence which I like. There is no fair borders in this world. So every country has some issues with other country about the border, because Europe was continuously fighting and
Right.
borders going back and forth. So
Right.
that is why we need to stop at some point and not continue this. With Armenia, situation is very, very bad, and where, yeah, there is the Karabakh existence, and Armenia is one of the oldest nations on this piece of earth. We know that the kingdom of Armenia was Eretria, and the mountain was taken from them. So it's now in the territory of Turkey, so the territory is shrinking. It's such a situation, but the internationally recognized borders were not in their favor. That is why we need to, with all our hearts, going towards Armenia, but we need to go with the borders what were internationally recognized. But the thing is that Russia put a lot of efforts into that area to create. Russia is doing, I would say, Russian Federation is going create the conflicts around the world. They are doing it all the time since Soviet Union, and that is why, as soon as Russia was get out of Karabakh, they were pretty peacefully resolved this, and they are now in the way of pretty peaceful coexistence, because Russia is not already represented, doesn't have their troops there, doesn't support those separatists. Regarding Azov, I want to say, when we talk about Nazis, we kind of lost in terminology. Initially, Nazi, what is Nazis? It's a racist theory where one nation is dominant nation. That was Aryan race for Germans. You are pure Aryan, so you are legitimate person on the earth. The rest do not need to exist. The rest is kind of second-hand people. This is not what the stand of Azov is. Even though they have some kind of symbols which remind swastikas, but it has nothing to do with swastikas. It goes with Azov. So I was very surprised that Azov is considered, or maybe considered, some kind of Nazi group here. There is no issue with any. Their slogan is Ukraine is first. This is what was the MAGA slogan, but we do not say that Trump is Nazi because
Actually,
Some of us do.
Some of us do.
So
Pretty much.
Ukraine is first for Ukrainians, and they stand on this. That doesn't mean that they are ready to erase every other nation of the world. So I don't think that terminology Nazi is applicable to Azov. So that is
Okay.
why.
Thank you. Fred has had his hand up for quite some time.
Thank you. Short question. I know you mentioned the aspect of religion with the Russian Empire. What do you think should be done to combat these religious fanatical beliefs that lend itself to the planet is going to destroy itself, and that's what our religion says, so that's okay. Be they the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, the Christian faith, seems to be a current, and once people are infected and assured of that idea, they believe they have license to stick their nose in our face?
Part of the answer is that we're in a battle of ideas. We're in a battle of ideas, and so and this is not new. The rise of religious fundamentalism, it takes place in the context of the crisis of socialism, the rise of neoliberalism, the increase in cynicism and irrationalism. And so part of what's happening is that this world is changing in ways that many people don't understand and are very uncomfortable with. And so religious fundamentalism gives people an anchor, something to believe in, even if it's wrong, even if it's lunacy, but it gives people something to believe in. And so we have to counter that. And we have to counter that with a different analysis. It's not just about throwing facts at people, but we have to create a different narrative that helps people explain why their lives are going to hell and what can actually be done. Religious fundamentalism resolves that problem. There was an old bumper sticker that my wife and I would joke about that went as follows: God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. Right? And that, in essence, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there's no silver bullet to resolve this, but it's a battle. So that means that we need to be battling when we have a Speaker of the House who basically says that the separation between church and state is a misnomer. We need to be saying, hey buddy, let's take you back to 3rd grade, right? And let's do a little basic history lessons. The problem is when we sit back passively and we just wring our hands and we talk about these are idiots. Well, they are idiots, but they're growing idiots, right? They're growing in power. We've got to stop them. When they show up, we got to be there and double the numbers. When they yell, we have to shout them down, right? When they start running this nonsense, whether it's about abortion or whether it's about trans or whether it's about so-called critical race theory or, God knows we can't make white people upset with history. We have to be there. That's the answer.
Yeah.
There's one, you're going to be last, Anita. You're going to be the last questioner, but you have a comment.
Just a quick one. When Trump came into the picture in 2015, that's when Political Research, that
Yeah.
group, and that was the group that enlightened me to dominionism.
Yes.
And almost everybody I would speak to had never heard of dominionism, which that's part of the problem. People don't realize, and because we have all dominionists now in our government, and that's the one on the right, the MAGAs.
Right.
That was their point, to head each department so that they could take over. And if you don't understand it, how can you fight it?
Right. So the
Chip,
Southern...
there's a book by Chip Burley and Matthew Lyons, Right-Wing Populism in America, and it was initiated by PRA, the organization.
Yeah, Political Research Associates.
Really,
Very good.
it explains all of this.
If you don't know Political Research Associates, Google them, look them up,
Yes.
because they are the researchers of the right wing in the
Yeah.
United States, the premier researchers, and they've been at it for decades. So they have such a profound depth and breadth of research on that. And the Southern Poverty Law Center
Yeah.
also writes about hate groups in its various publications, and that's where I think I read about dominionism. And there's only going to be one more question from Anita. The gentleman who just raised their hand has already spoken, so it's going to have to be Anita.
Okay, thank you.
Esquire. Anita Thayer, Esquire.
Well, thank you, Bill, for coming to Albany and leading this discussion, which has been very helpful and interesting and informative. My question is about national politics and what your thoughts are. I mean, because we're faced with the rise of the right wing and the possible election of Trump, and the Democrats are like, they're handicapping themselves by the mainstream position on the Middle East and pro-Israel. And there's increasing popularity, like, for a ceasefire in Gaza, and the mainstream Democrats just won't deal with that for the most part. And they're going to lose, the Democrats are going to lose on this issue if they don't figure out how to get on the right side of history. And I wonder what your comments are, or observations, or analysis is on that front.
First of all, the election is a year away, and any number of things could happen. We should not assume that it will be Biden versus Trump. It could be, no, really, it could very well be someone else going against Nikki Haley. And it could be any number of things. So don't get trapped in this. The second is ignore polls. The polls are worthless. If you look at the polls over the last few years, whether you go back to the 2016 election, whether you look at 2020, 2022, we have been misled repeatedly by the polls. And so by and large, we should ignore them. Additionally, what needs to happen right now is that the Biden administration needs to be hammered. We should not worry about whether hammering him, what the impact is going to be on 2024. Don't worry about that right now. They need to be hammered. We need to be kicking them in the rear around Gaza. And yes, there are things that the administration has done that we should support, particularly around the environment and some labor things. But on this critical question of Gaza, we need to be kicking them in the rear. Now, one of the things that has to be thought about is there's no room in 2024 for third parties. All of the people that are talking about running as third-party candidates will hurt the Democrats. No question, no doubt it, as my father would have said. Whether it's RFK Jr., whether it's Jill Stein, whether it's Manchin, right? All of them, Cornel West, they will pick away potential Democratic Party voters because Trump's voters, by and large, with possible exception of some of the independents that are swerving, are not going to break away. Now, if it's not Trump, all bets are off in terms of where those folks will go. All right? So Trump may be in jail. I mean, any number of things could happen. We should encourage, I think, Biden to retire.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure that there's any way he can walk back what the damage that he's done, unfortunately. I was not one of those, by the way, even though I would have preferred someone younger, I was not one of those that says, oh, he's too old. Because no one was saying that about Donald, and Donald's not that much younger.
Donald and I are the same age.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, then he's a kid.
Except that he lived wrong.
That's right. He did.
Yeah.
He did.
I lived right.
I think that Biden, and see, I don't call them mainstream. They're establishment Democrats. They're not mainstream. The mainstream is actually with us on Gaza. And the mainstream wants a ceasefire. The problem is that the alliance, and I wish we had more time, the alliance that has existed between the Israeli establishment and the U.S. political establishment going back to 1947, before Israel was formed, and then especially after the Six-Day War, has made it very difficult for the U.S. establishment to put the pressure that, for example, Eisenhower put on Israel, Britain, and France in 1956, when he told us to get the hell out of Egypt, right? And they did, almost immediately. There's no administration that has had the courage to basically take that step. I mean, I'm surprised I'm praising Eisenhower.
Yeah, I know.
So the political situation is really complicated. I think that we have tremendous possibility with Congress. I think that these midterm elections showed that what the polls were all saying, you know, that it wasn't gonna happen, you know, that nothing, you know, none of this progressive stuff was gonna happen. And then midterm elections, and then the elections just a few weeks ago, where you have all of these good ballot initiatives and progressive and liberal Democrats getting elected. So I am not despairing at all. We have to put pressure and encourage Biden to retire. Now, there are tactical things we can do, which we don't have time to get into, but that's what I would argue right now. There's no room for despair. Let me just say that, and there's also no room for third-partyism. None.
I agree.
There's none. But right now, don't spend your time arguing with people about November 2024. Argue with them about, let's get out there and pressure this administration to do the right thing on Gaza.
And there's an opportunity for that this afternoon, actually.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah,
there's an opportunity to do just what Bill just said this afternoon down at West Capitol, by the Capitol, West Capitol Park, and it is the Palestinian Students Justice for Palestine, SJP, from Albany. And as you know, organizations, both Jewish and Palestinian and Muslim and Arab organizations, all those organizations are under attack by their academic institutions in the United States. So,
Okay, we got it.
yes, oh, I know that.
Susan, do we need to put the chairs back?
Yeah.